It's nice to be back in the Pure Church. It seems like I've been gone a lot. Wendy says she hasn't seen me ever since I retired. It's later. Last time I forgot when Sandy was going to read it, so we changed it this time so I wouldn't forget. Yesterday I went to my class reunion, an all-school reunion in White River, and I know most of you are out for summer vacation, but after having a reunion, we're going back to school. We're going to Ruth 201 today. So if you want to follow around, most of the Bible verses that we will talk about will be in Ruth. And if you'll remember when you were in school, you had English 1, and then you had English 2, and then you had English 3. If you went to college, then you started out with English 101. Spanish 101 was just learning the words. Uno, dos, tres, hola, si, gracias. Spanish 201 would have been a little bit more complicated. I was never very good at Spanish because I couldn't roll my R's. They used to say butter really fast. Well, that didn't help. But I think Spanish 201 would have sounded a bit more like this. Todos las cosas trabajan juntos para bien. Could you understand that? All things work together for good, is what I was trying to say. So, the book of Ruth. We're kind of familiar with Ruth 101. Naomi and her husband went to Moab when there was a famine in the land of Israel. Naomi's husband and 2 sons died, leaving Naomi and her daughters-in-laws all alone. Orpah stayed in Moab, and Ruth joined Naomi and went back to Bethlehem, where she eventually met and married Boaz. Boaz redeemed Naomi's family, and Ruth gave birth to an ancestor of Christ. Now that was a really short synopsis of Ruth, but I'm sure you filled in the rest of the story in your head as I was talking. But is there more to Ruth? I've been studying Ruth since May, and in just 4 little chapters, there's an awful lot of stuff. We can zoom in or we can zoom out. And if we zoom out for the large picture, we can see that Ruth is a comprehensive snapshot of the entire Bible. The Bible is a story of a Jewish wedding. There's a Jewish redeemer married to a Gentile bride, and it's all about redemption. Boaz represents Christ and how he showed love to everyone, redeeming one of Israel's most bitter enemies and also redeeming Naomi, an Israelite. It's how God uses people to bring about providence through their choices, and how all things will work together for good for those that love the Lord and are called to his purpose. Or we can zoom in the other way and we can study each character. Naomi is like a female Job. She loses everything, her family, her status, her livelihood. She questions God, and yet she can still see how God works in her life. And then there is Ruth. Ruth takes action, and she finds a job to support them. And then there's Boaz. Boaz was a person whose little actions made a big difference. He followed God's laws to leave the corners of the field unharvested so that the poor could benefit. He followed the land's laws to do things in a right way. He was generous and patient and discreet. He was a good person. We can also study how the different things of the courts worked from back then and how they work today. Israel law looked at the person. Mesopotamian law looked at the property. God's plan was for a settlement, a mediation to fix the problem, not to point blame or to punish. We could also talk about customs such as the levirate law or taking off the shoe to seal a contract. So we're going to just jump in and cover a little of all of that. The book of Ruth starts in the time of the judges, when everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. We're told that it was a lawless, dangerous time. It was a dark time of apostasy, anarchy, spiritual decay, and immorality in Israel. No one was following the rules, and most everybody did not care about God. But if you look at that just on the surface, don't we all do what is right in our own eyes? I mean, how many of us would try to do something that was wrong? Regardless, there was a famine in the land. Now, we can speculate on whether God caused the famine because his chosen people had once again left him. Or did he allow but not cause the famine? Maybe it was just nature taking its course. There is a cycle of events that reoccur in the Bible. There's sin, and then there's suffering. Finally, there's supplication, and then salvation. God's judgments can bring famine. They can bring war. God does sometimes remove his protection in order to get our attention. But one thing we know is that God can bring good out of a mess, no matter who causes it. Well, this famine led to Elimelech taking his wife and 2 sons to Moab to find food. Do you remember where the Moabites came from? If you look back to Genesis chapter 19, verses 36 and 37, you'll remember how Lot's daughters got pregnant after sleeping with their father. It was one of the most sinful acts recorded in the Bible. But both daughters got pregnant and had children. One child was Moab, the beginning of the Moabites, and the other one was Ammon, the beginning of the Ammonites. In Deuteronomy 23, God told Israel not to seek relationships with the Moabites. Then in Numbers, Moab was the country that hired Balaam to curse God and to curse the Israelites. Moab was an oppressor of Israel. So Elimelech going to Moab would have been similar to some Jews going to Germany in 1946. We don't know what all happened in Moab during the 10 years that they spent there. All we know is that Elimelech died. His sons, Mahlon and Chilion, married Moabite wives, and then the sons also died. We might ask if God caused the deaths of those 3 men just to save Ruth in the end. Think about how much effort God puts into reaching you, the blessings, the circumstances, the people that he put in your path to bring you here. Providence includes how God works in both good and bad consequences. Providence arranges the details, but people make the choices and take steps. Providence allows for human responses. God is in ultimate control, but he works with all things to fulfill his purposes. Each of the players in Ruth, in the Bible, and in our lives have the freedom to make choices. We may choose to be or not to be an active participant in God's plans. Thankfully, God is not limited to plan A. He makes a move, we make a move. Each move affects what the next move will be, similar to playing checkers. So here we are 10 years later, and Naomi has lost not only her husband and sons, but also her status and her protection. Women had lives much different in those times than we have today. They couldn't own land. Naomi had become part of the lowliest. She was poor and widowed. It's interesting to note that Ruth is written and seen through the eyes of a woman. We don't have to imagine how she felt because she tells us. Naomi questions God, just like Job did. Naomi says in verse 1:13, "The hand of the Lord is gone out against me." Yet even though she feels God is against her, she also gives God credit. If you look in verse 6, she says, "The Lord has visited his people in giving them bread again in Israel." When she got back to Bethlehem, she told her friends, "Call me Mara," which means bitter. People in Bible times understood the equations. Righteousness equals blessings. Sin equals suffering. In John 9, the question is asked of Jesus, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Now, the equations and the math isn't exactly right, but Naomi made a right choice. Even though she felt God was against her, it was still better to return to the promised land and trust in God than it was to stay in Moab. She didn't have a grand plan. She just took the next right step, the next right thing. No matter where we are in life, we can turn around. We can ride on the merry-go-round of life, sinning, suffering, praying for relief, getting relief, and trying to do or be better for a time. And then we go around again. But we need to jump off that merry-go-round. And if when we get off we're a little bit dizzy, we just need to stand still and wait a little bit for God. And then we can turn back to the promised land. So almost every class that you go to has some definitions that you need to learn. And we are going to start in chapter 1, verse 9, rest. "The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Rest is more than just ceasing from your labor or taking a nap. Rest was found when you had security and protection under a husband. Again, you have to remember that women in these times were nothing without their fathers, their brothers, or their husbands' protection. Ruth and Orpah could regain an identity of wives and mothers by marriage, but for Naomi, it was too late. Today we might find that condescending because women can and often do take care of themselves. But let's compare it to the Sabbath rest. Our relationship with Jesus is considered a marriage. He refers to himself as a bridegroom in Matthew 9:15. And to rest is to be under his wings of protection. Matthew 11:29. "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest in your souls." Truly, we cannot rest without the security of knowing the bridegroom. There's another definition, and this is one I learned. In those times, a widow was not simply someone who lost her husband. If the wife could return to her father's authority, she was not a widow, only if she was independent of all family ties. This person all alone needed society's help, and that's why the policies were set aside for their care, such as leaving the corners of the field unharvested. As you read your Bible, notice how many times Jesus made sure to care for those who are outside or low on society's social scale. Deuteronomy 25 has a solution to help with many of those widows. It says, "If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. Her husband's brother shall go into her, take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn son which she bears will succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. This is called the Levirate marriage. The land also could not be orphaned. The Levirate marriage included that the firstborn would inherit the deceased man's land. That way they could preserve the family line and keep the land in the family. This was God's attempt to keep Israel going. No family would lose their land. No one would be poor with no heirs. That goes on to explain, like even in the Jubilee, if you had to sell your land, it was only temporary. After 50 years, the land always came back to the family. Ruth had seen something in Naomi and her God, and so she decided to leave her past behind. She said, "Your God is my God now." Being a poor widow was bad enough, but being a Moabite widow in Israel had to be worse. She was a foreigner. She was from the enemy. It was a small town, and everybody knew that Naomi was back. They knew she'd returned without her husband or her sons. They knew Ruth had come with her. Surely they knew that she needed help, but it seemed that no one offered to help their old friend. But Ruth didn't wait around. She went to work. She started gleaning to care for herself and Naomi. Moving on to Boaz. He had also heard about Ruth, even though he hadn't seen her yet. When he saw her in his field, he asked, "Who is this damsel?" But by chapter 2, verse 11, he said, it had been shown to him all the things she had done for her mother-in-law since the death of her husband, and he asked a blessing upon her. Verse 12, "The Lord recompense thy work, and a full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust." Isn't that a great phrase? Under his wings we have come to trust. We'll see that phrase again. Boaz doesn't realize it yet, but later he himself will be used to answer his own prayer. Do you think it was just happenstance that she ended up in Boaz's field? I don't. Boaz was following the gleaner law we mentioned earlier. When you reap the harvests of the land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You should leave them for the poor and for the alien. Now, every landowner didn't do this. Remember, we were in the time of the judges and everyone was doing what they wanted to do. But Boaz did. He went the extra mile. He told her to stay with his harvesters. He told his crew not to hurt her. He shared his water, told her to come over for meals, and he even let her glean among the sheaves that everyone else was harvesting. Boaz was faithful, compassionate, and generous, and each small act that he did was a big deal. So that night, after seeing all that Ruth brought home, Naomi said in verse 2:20, "Blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead." Naomi explains about a kinsman redeemer, a Gaye. The Gaye's job was to redeem the land which might have been sold to pay off any debts, to redeem any kin who had sold himself as a slave, to avenge a death if he was slain by an enemy, and to marry the widow and become a trustee of the property on behalf of the offspring. The word rest reappears in chapter 3, verse 1. Naomi says, "My daughter, shall I not seek rest for thee, that it may be well with you?" Again, this is referring to marriage. Naomi instructs Ruth to clean up, anoint herself, wait till he's in a good mood, and everyone is left. He'll lay down to guard the harvest through the night. Then uncover his feet and lie down beside him. This was not a sexual encounter. This was Ruth asking Boaz to marry her. In some places, this is still the custom. You go up to someone of interest and place a garment over part of the body. After Boaz woke up, he noticed her, and she asked him to spread his skirt over her because he was a near kinsman. Thy skirt literally means thy wing, under his wing. By doing so, it was a fulfillment of Boaz's prayer that we read in 2:12. She was claiming his protection as a wife. Boaz understood this tradition and agreed to the marriage. If a closer kinsman would not do his part as a kinsman, he would. He was signaling his intention as well. The shoe, uncover his feet, was a contract. And in that time, the contract was way more important than the wedding rites itself. We're going to go back to the part about Naomi instructing Ruth to adorn herself. Israelite customs expected a marriage like this to happen, but it could have been an emotionless duty. Naomi was preparing Ruth for marriage. Let's turn to Ezekiel 16, chapter 8, verses 8 to 14. Pay attention to the words and see if it sounds like a marriage to you. I passed by you again and looked at you. You were at the age for love. I spread the edge of my cloak over you and covered your nakedness. I pledged myself to you and entered into a covenant with you, saith the Lord God, and you became mine. Then I bathed you with water and washed off the blood and anointed you with oil. I clothed you with embroidered cloth and with sandals of fine leather. I bound you in fine linen and covered you with rich fabric, adorned you with ornaments. I put bracelets on your arms, a chain on your neck, a ring on your nose, earrings in your ears, and a beautiful crown upon your head. You were adorned with gold and silver, while your clothing was of fine linen, rich fabric, and embroidered cloth. You had choice flour and honey and oil for food. You grew exceedingly beautiful, like a queen. Your fame spread among the nations on account of your beauty, for it was perfect because of my splendor that I bestowed on you, saith the Lord. Naomi was transforming a business transaction into a courtship by showing off Ruth's positive qualities, and Boaz had already noticed them. In chapter 4, Boaz goes to the gate. The gate is where court was held in walled cities. In country towns, the circular open space of cleared threshing floors was used. The threshing floor was where Ruth confronted Boaz. And now Boaz restates the situation to resolve the issue of transferring the right to marry Ruth before the elders. Things were less complicated than today, but there were still formalities. When we think of courts, we think of judgment and punishment. Today we have crimes against the state, but in that place and time, the state wasn't involved. The crime was against a person. People went to court for settlement, not guilt. The purpose was to restore harmony, to mediate, to set things right. Court was where people went for help, and the court came into being when they got an appeal, and once it was settled, the court was disbanded. There was reconciliation. The goal wasn't to punish or remove the criminal from the street. It was for the health of the community. The moral laws were to provide help to the needy. And the court was the plaintiff's neighbors. They knew him and they cared about him. It was people-oriented. So Boaz goes to the gate and he asks the nearer relative to sit down, and he brought 10 elders of the city. Both men probably helped pick the elders. Everybody knew that court was in session. It was a formal meeting, not a morning coffee break. Boaz mentions Naomi selling Elimelech's land, which means it had not yet been transferred to the sons. When just the land was being discussed, the other relative is all in. Sure, I'll do it. However, when Boaz brought up that he would also be marrying Ruth, the other relative declined. He knew that if they had a child, the child would inherit the land, and if he had no other children, the son would also inherit the land he already owned, and that was too big of a risk. So he says in verse 8, "Buy it for thee," and he drew off his shoe. Ruth had uncovered Boaz's feet earlier, and now this shoe removal. Both allude to the removing of a sandal, as in Deuteronomy 25:9, concerning the Levirate law. The formality of the witnesses were a vital part of Ruth's redemption. Court was over and everyone was happy. They didn't condemn the relative who chose not to be a kinsman. Instead, they called for another blessing in chapter 4, verses 11. Then all the people who were at the gate, along with the elders, said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you produce children in Ephratah and bestow a name in Bethlehem. And through the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." Now that one I especially had to research. Why would they want it to be like the house of Perez? In case you've forgotten, Tamar was another foreigner for whom the Levirate law applied. But in this case, one son refused to do his duty, and the next brother married someone else. So Tamar ended up tricking Judah, and she became pregnant through him. It was kind of an immoral mess, no matter how you looked at it. So I wondered, why Perez? And I looked in the rest of the Bible, and there isn't much said, but it does say that Perez was the head of his clan, and in Nehemiah, after the exile, it says that the Perizzites were valiant warriors. So something good came out of something bad. And both Tamar and Ruth are listed in the bloodline of Christ. And Boaz is foreshadowing Christ, our Redeemer. Now, Naomi and Ruth and Boaz were ordinary people doing ordinary things. So how do we take the lessons from their story and apply it to our ordinary lives of marriages, births, deaths, and the job of finding food? I wish there was an easy, surefire solution when you're unjustly accused, when a coworker plays spiteful games, or when a spouse snaps on you for no reason. When you think that either God hates you or he's not there, or maybe he's against you. Just call me bitter. We think that God owes us a better life. And there are two reasons that we feel this way. First off, we might be thinking too highly of ourselves because we don't deserve better. We deserve death. All have sinned, and the wages of sin is death. Anything else that we get is a bonus. In Isaiah 41:14, God even calls us a worm, but he still promises to help us. Secondly, we think too little of God. We're not looking at the big view. Just because we don't see or understand in the moment, we need to believe that God will never leave us, and he will work things out. When Naomi had lost everything, did she suddenly think that her circumstances were too big for God to handle? She didn't say that, but her actions seemed that way when she told her daughters to go back to those gods in Moab. Now tell me, why would any true believer want their relatives to go back to the Moab gods? No, it wasn't too hard for God. God redeemed Israel from the dark ages of the judges. He redeemed them from the famine. He redeems Naomi. He redeems a Moabite. I believe our church is going through a type of spiritual famine, but God's redemption knows no bounds. He can take our darkness and he can turn it around because God is greater than any sin. Like Naomi, we need to turn back to the promised land. Like Ruth, we need to accept Naomi's God and take an action, find a way to serve. Like Boaz, we need to follow the biblical instructions that we already know, and we need to commit and keep walking in faith no matter what. Isaiah 43. But now thus saith the Lord, He created you, O Jacob, He who formed you, O Israel. Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I'll be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. Naomi prayed over her daughters-in-law. Boaz asked a blessing over Ruth. The elders asked a blessing over the house of Boaz. I too would like to ask for a blessing over our church, that we may see the acts of God in every happenstance or coincidence and know that there is bread again in Israel, that our house may be like the house of Perez and that we might be valiant warriors.